1977 was the first year of the so-called Torino bird, and the Torino bird would last all the way through the 1979 model year. So it was produced for 3 model years, 1977, 1978, and 1979, before the so-called box bird would take over. And that was kind of an unhappy bird, the Thunderbird before the Arrow bird. In any case, today we're going to take a look at this beautiful 1978 Diamond Jubilee Edition, about 15,000-mile Thunderbird. Now, why was this called the so-called Torino bird? Well, as you can imagine, it was based off of the Torino platform. And by the way, the 1972 to 1976 Big Bird that shared a lot of components with the 1972 to 76 Mark IV also had quite a bit in common, actually, with the Torino. So the Torino part sharing was starting relatively early on the Thunderbird, and this was during a point in time when Ford was starting to push the Thunderbird down market and make it less of a luxury car. The Thunderbird had always been a personal luxury coupe ever since it became a 4-place car, beginning with the 1958 model year. But times had changed, and inflation had hit the pocketbooks of many individuals, and Ford decided to push the Thunderbird base price down market, make the car a little bit smaller, make it a little bit cheaper. And it actually was a strategy that worked out brilliantly. It spurred Thunderbird sales during this particular time and helped resurrect them when they really weren't all that great for the 1972 to 1976 Big Bird generation. So let's talk a little bit about this particular 1978 car. Now, the Torino bird brought back the hidden headlamps to the Thunderbird lineup. They were gone during the so-called Big Bird years. But by this point, I guess Ford wanted to put a little bit of glitz and glam back in the Thunderbird. And I think the hidden headlamps look pretty classy on this vehicle, although I have to say by this point, sometimes the headlamp actuators are dead on these, and then after you shut the key off, they pop open. The fail-safe mode on these is to fail open. So if you see that and you're buying one of these, and the second you turn the key off, the headlamp doors pop open, well, you're going to be searching for a pair of headlamp actuators, which these days isn't all that easy to find. Now, you do have a little bit of the so-called Knudsen nose on this, the nose that was prominent on the 1970 to 1971 Thunderbirds that was introduced by Bunky Knudsen when he wanted Fords to look more like Pontiacs. And you still have a little bit of that arrowhead here in terms of the hood forms as well as the grille that's got that point to it. But you do have the egg crate texture up front. Remember, as I said, the Thunderbird was supposed to be a luxury car, and what kind of grille do many luxury cars have? Egg crate texture, except, of course, the Mark vehicles from Lincoln, because Lee Iacocca wanted to put a Rolls-Royce style grille on the Thunderbird for those. Now, as we rotate around to some of the side views of the car, kind of this front three-quarter-esque side view, we'll notice a couple things. Here you have the very stereotypical flat fender profile from Ford up front and the W-shaped front end that Ford still had. The W, for those who don't know, if you look up from above, kind of from a plan view perspective, you'll see the fenders as well as the midsection of the grille form this W shape. And that was something that had started really in the 1960s, but Ford continued it all the way here, even with the bumper standard. And look how far out that bumper is from the grille as well as the headlamp doors. But despite the relatively flat fender profile, you do have a little bit of lead in here. It does rise a little bit, as opposed to the mid-70s Lincoln Town cars where it was just an absolutely flat fender profile. This, to me, looks much better to have that lead in and a slight taper to the rear. You also don't have all that much in terms of the body side sculpture, just pretty plain, large rocker molding, some louvers behind the front wheel, a big cornering lamp, and, well, you have the so-called basket handle with the mini opera window on this Torino bird. That was something that was a first for the Thunderbird. You did, of course, have the opera windows on the previous generation Thunderbird, as well as the Mark IV, but you didn't have that basket handle motif. And here you've got kind of that basket handle with the sheet metal that goes over the roof and a vinyl top behind it. And this one has the sunroof in front of it. A very rare car because of the Diamond Jubilee trim. But, you know, overall, it's kind of an interesting look. I kind of like it overall. Not too bad. And as we rotate to the side view, you can see another Ford trait of this era, and that is the overhangs, particularly the front overhang. Ford was, during this time frame, enamored with, for whatever reason, kind of equivalent overhangs in the front and rear, which is bizarre from a design standpoint because you typically want some good dash to axle. You want those front wheels pushed further forward, particularly for, I would think, a personal luxury coupe for like a Thunderbird. But Ford didn't want that. I guess it gave you enough space to have a bigger cornering lamp. And you can see that on this Diamond Jubilee Edition with that padded vinyl top out back, it is kind of a very intimate cabin back there. There's not much window or glass area relative to other vehicles of the time. Kind of looks a bit closed in, but I guess that was the look that Ford was going for during this particular time frame. Now out back we have a variation of the full width tail lamp treatment. Full width tail lights were something that was found on many, many different Thunderbirds of the previous generation. Here you kind of got, a little bit of a full width tail lamp. It at least dips underneath that bulge in the deck lid. That bulge in the deck lid was also something that you'd see on a lot of Thunderbirds. Sometimes you would see that midsection sit proud of the outer flanks of the deck lid like you do here. And on other Thunderbirds, you would see actually the outer portions of the deck lid sit from have more of an elevated surfacing versus the center. So here I think the designers kind of inverted the typical theme for the Thunderbird, but that was always something that you saw on many Thunderbirds of the era. Of course, you've got the Thunderbird logo in each tail lamp and then these big reverse lights because you want people to know that you are reversing. And color-keyed bumper guards as well as a rub strip and color-keyed wheels on the Diamond Jubilee Edition. I love that they went to the extent of color keying the rub strips and the bumper guards because nothing says luxury like color keyed bumper guards. And here you can see what I was saying a little bit better about that midsection and the hump in the trunk that is in between that dipped area that you see in the midsection. I wish they had a trunk lock cover on here as opposed to just the keyhole. I think it would look a little bit more luxurious. But again, this was the time frame, as I mentioned, that Ford was kind of pushing the Thunderbird down market, and so I guess you didn't get the trunk lock cover. Would have been nice to have a little bird that you rotated out of the way to open your trunk. Oh well, especially wait till you see the trunk in this particular car. Now, the interior of this Diamond Jubilee Edition Thunderbird or Torino Bird was a relatively luxurious place to be. Some buttons and biscuits and a little bit of the loose cushion look. But the velour was certainly quite comfortable. You did get a leather-wrapped steering wheel. Although it was just a typical Ford wheel, of course, Ford had to put the Thunderbird logo on it. Wasn't a fan of that droopy two-spoker that they used on everything during this time frame with really minimal variations. Kind of liked when Ford used to have different steering wheels. It gave the interiors a little bit different character, but not here on the so-called Torino Bird cars. And you do, of course, have the shoulder belts and the lap belts in the sling to accommodate what now was an increased safety environment in the inside. These cars were starting to be designed for crash standards, and the seat belts were getting a little bit more advanced as well. Ford had started with this sling-style design in the mid-1970s, and it continued here. Now, one thing that you did get in your Diamond Jubilee Edition was a full complement of gauges, including a tachometer, even though this was a car that you're going to see had a 351 cubic inch 2-Venturi or 2-barrel carburetor on it. Wasn't really all that sporting in terms of performance. But you do see those gauges, at least the holes for them, and very large crash pad atop this dash, and some extremely thick padding, although you can see in the midsection of the dash where the padding ends, you just have a hard plastic lower. So they tried to make it look a little bit luxurious, but I don't think that that went over all that well because you would hope that that padding would have extended to more of the dash, but it is what it is. Now, interestingly, one place where Ford did elect to spend a fair amount of money was the carpet and trunk trim. Take a look at this trunk trim. I mean, it's luxuriously lined in this thick carpet. You never see this on trunks today. Often the trunk trim is either just hard plastic or mouse fur. And well, I guess this was a time frame in which the American auto companies were trying to dress up some things, but it's just odd that they would spend so much money to me on the trunk trim, because you're not really putting things that are all that luxurious back here. In fact, you're probably carrying groceries or things that will spill, but oh well, that's what they did to make this Diamond Jubilee Thunderbird a little bit more luxurious. Now, across the entire Thunderbird lineup, you could get 3 different V8 engines. You could get the 302 cubic inch V8 that made around 133 horsepower, the 351 made around 144 horsepower that you see here, and then there was the 400 cubic inch V8 that made 166 horsepower. So none of these engines were overly powerful for the particular time frame. But the 351 was one that was relatively common on all of these. And I have to say, you can see that it's outfitted with some significant amount of emissions, let's say style items. And it really choked these engines down. If you floor it and give it the beans, you just don't really have all that much there, particularly at the upper RPM ranges. But you do have a decent amount of torque on these, especially given that the car is smaller, so that helps motivate it a little bit better. Now, the other thing that you'll notice is Ford had reverted back in this particular generation of Thunderbird to the Tecumseh York 2-piston style compressor, that it had expunged from the Thunderbird lineup and it had gone to use the GM A6 style air conditioning compressor, because that was better and provided more cooling capacity, and it also was smoother. That's the one thing about these 2-piston assemblies, is when you turn them on and you engage them, you definitely notice that the air conditioning is on more than you do in a General Motors vehicle, or even the Chrysler cars with the Chrysler AirTemp V-twin compressor. So Fords didn't have all the best air conditioning. They would eventually design their own compressor. Ford actually had never made their own air conditioning compressor up until this point, believe it or not, whereas Chrysler and General Motors had. So that was something that was coming for Ford, and that would significantly help them along the way. So what are your thoughts about this Diamond Jubilee Edition Thunderbird and the Torino Bird in general? I think, like I said, it became a sales success, and it really supercharged Thunderbird sales during this particular generation versus the Big Bird. Unfortunately, the Box Bird, the 1980 to 1982 Thunderbird, that would kill Thunderbird sales yet again, as Ford went too boxy and too conservative. But the Aero Bird would come and would be introduced for the 1983 model year, and that would really put the Thunderbird on top again, thank goodness. The Aero Bird has to be one of my favorite vehicles, and imagine what that looked like in the context of 1983. Certainly looked like a more futuristic car than what Chrysler and what General Motors were producing in general. Have to give it to Jack Telnack and the Ford design team for introducing that Aero Bird. So what do you think? Put a comment in the comment section about the various Thunderbirds and let me know what's your favorite. Thanks again for watching.